nerds, what's up? Today we're going to talk about the first half of The World of Ice and Fire by George R.R. Martin. Now, I know I was warned that this was a coffee table book, but in my head, that just meant there was lots of pictures and it wasn't necessarily a single narrative. I just was unprepared for it to actually be coffee book size. Like, this book is so ridiculous to read. I just had to start with that. Okay, so you might have noticed I said the first half. The reason is I finished kind of more of the historical part of it and I got into the second half, which is more about the different locations within A Song of Ice and Fire. And although I'm really enjoying that, it is taking me a lot longer to read. It's not something I necessarily like sit down and read straight through as a novel. I'm just kind of reading a few pages here and there. And I was worried I was going to forget about a lot of the stuff I want to talk about during the Targaryen reign portion of the novel. So I just decided I'm going to talk about it now. And if I have burning things to talk about in the second half, when it's just kind of going over the locations, then I will. But I also read some of the locations and I don't feel like I'm going to have a lot to say. You can tell me that I'm wrong in the comments below. But anyway, and this time, because you guys say I never say enough, I've marked and we're just going to casually go through everything I've marked. Like, I'm not editing down my thoughts. I'm just going to say them. So we'll see if you guys like this format for this more unusual book in the series. Without further ado, I'll see you after the jump. I guess I should have said this in the first part of the video. I'm really enjoying this book, like highly enjoying it. More than I expected to. It is very different from Fire and Blood in that, again, it's not like quite the narrative, but even here, you still get a lot of it. The first thing I marked was not even really in the book itself. I just love the detail of in the title page. I don't know if I'm gonna be able to show this. I'll do like a close-up picture of it, that you can see erase marks. So you see that it used to say Robert and then it was erased and says Joffrey and now it says Tommen. I loved this because it gave me a sense immediately of what time in the series this book was written in world. And at the time, that was just a fun little thing. But as we get towards the end of what I want to talk about, that became a very important detail for me as I was reading. And I just love that. It's just off the bat, just such a great way to start. The first thing I marked after that was talking about Nymeria. This was just like, I didn't really know who Nymeria was. Like, I did from a little bit of what Arya says about her, but I liked reading about her wolf's namesake. I don't have much to say about that. It was just like one of those details that's very fun to get more of. On that same page, we hear a story about Mother Ryoin. You guys are gonna be mad how I said that. That's fine. I loved this story. I have all of these thoughts about religion in A Song of Ice and Fire, and this story kind of reminded me of them. One of the most interesting things to me about religion in A Song of Ice and Fire, and I might make a video about this someday, is that you're just never really sure, which gods are real. When people ask the gods for things and they deliver, is that a coincidence? Is it true? Do those gods exist? How does religion play? And so you hear this story about, someone calling down a curse and treating Mother Ryoin to avenge her children, and then the very night it flooded out of season with any greater force than living memory. And it's like, is that a coincidence? Is that magic? Is that religion? I just love that theme consistently throughout the novels, and I thought this was like a very good example of it. Now we're gonna get into some stuff that I obviously read in Fire and Blood, but there was so much in Fire and Blood I didn't say enough, so sometimes my mind was jogged here about things I wish I would have talked about. And one thing was the Faith Militant, because I already knew what Cersei did in, Feast for Crows or Dance with Dragons? I think it was Feast for Crows. Yeah. Oh, it's kind of blending together for me. But anyway, when she reinstates the Faith Militant, I knew it was a bad idea. I'm a smart enough reader to understand that that's an interesting choice. But reading again about the history in Fire and Blood of the Faith Militant and being reminded here what that was, it gives so much context to what happened in the main series. It's definitely I'm so glad I read Fire and Blood before my full reread, because I do think you get so much contextual items that are going to enrich in the political maneuverings of that novel, because obviously A Song of Ice and Fire is known for its political maneuverings, and like I said, on the front level, they all make sense. But those like deeper behind the scenes, like when you're hearing about this with Maegor, I think it's just going to make her decisions even seem worse on a reread. Oh, another thing I thought about while reading this is what a bad thing it is to be named Jane in A Song of Ice and Fire. Not exactly a sophisticated thought, but one I thought I should mention. I think a lot of you wanted to know whether I was Team Green or Team Black, and I was Team Black. I was completely on Rhaenyra's side. I think I should just state that here. I'm not going to talk a lot about that since I talked a lot about the dance and things in my other video, but I didn't explicitly say that. I'm not saying it makes sense, but that's whose side I'm on, and I thought I should make that clear. The next thing, I pretty much skip all the stuff that I already talked about in Fire and Blood, but Baelor, man, I am fascinated by Baelor for several reasons. How did he get this way? That when you think of his history, this is the thing, I am so interested. This is what I've learned. I'm not saying this well. I can't wait for Fire and Blood 2 because I need to know how Baelor happened. Why is he so devout? What happened with his parentage that would make a child like this? I just can't quite conceptualize it. And again, like I just recently talked about, that religion thing. It's such a fascinating look at how George R. R. Martin writes religion. Because there is magic and because things happen, it is so up in the air. I would love your guys' opinion on what you think about that, or if it's case by case. Then as I kept reading, I did that thing, you know that meme where it's like the pointing meme with Leonardo DiCaprio, when it says, bestowing upon him the sword of Aegon the Conqueror Blackfyre, as well as lands and other honors. Daemon took the name Blackfyre thereafter. And you're like, Blackfyre Rebellion. Okay, here we go. Here's that info. I mean, I didn't know that. Like I said, there's so much going on in the main series that when you read this, it really gives you an opportunity to solidify all of the history you've probably given piecemeal, and I'm going to talk about that again later. But Aegon IV was gross. Here's another element that recontextualizes the story of the main series more when you actually get to read about him legitimizing all of his bastards. Now, that was brought up by Catelyn when Robb tries to legitimize Jon, which, for the record, because you guys know I'm a huge Catelyn fan, I was on Robb's side here. I loved that he was writing that letter to Jon. But Catelyn, he's all like, oh, remember when, he legitimized all the bastards and what the problem it caused. Again, I didn't need any more context than that. That made perfect sense to me within the story. But reading what happened, just again, I love getting the full story behind it because it enriches what is happening and why Catelyn would be so worried. Again, a point for Catelyn. Maybe Catelyn haters just haven't read Fire and Blood and A World of Ice and Fire, and they just don't have the full context. I feel like I have to, for legal reasons, say I'm joking, or I will get a lot of mean comments. This is where we begin how feral I feel hearing anything about Duncan Egg, because we start hearing about his death was a mishap because of a random trial of the Seven fought on behalf of a lowly hedge knight of no parentage of note. So I started getting very excited here. My excitement didn't last long because it is very sad, but I did love getting to hear about Aegon the Unlikely and getting to hear about that and finding out that he named his first son Duncan. Everything around Duncan Egg is just a breath of fresh air. Like, that's so sweet, and knowing that he was the one who likely elevated him to Captain of the Kingsguard, which I did know. I think I put that in my video because I'd gone back and looked at when Jamie reads through the names that you can see Duncan's name there. And so I love getting to read that. Now, that being said, let's talk about Summerhall here. I don't think I want to read it. Of all the things that we talk about George not finishing things, there might be a positive element to that, which is that if he never finishes the Duncan Egg novellas, then I don't have to read what clearly is going to be extremely depressing at Summerhall. And in some ways, we can look at the glass half full, that could be beneficial. But one thing I wanted to see is this letter of Maester Corso. It says, this is the only thing that survives Summerhall. And it says, the blood of the dragon gathered in one, 7 eggs to honor the 7 gods, though the king's own septon had warned. Pyromancers, wildfire, flames grew out of control, towering, burned so hot that, died, but for the valor of the Lord command. And that's all it says. So Dunk did something really brave, right? That's what that means. Died but for the valor of the Lord command. So what did Duncan do? Who did he save? Why was it hidden? What happened there? Maybe I do want to know. But if I don't know, then it can't be sad. But I do want to know. So what's the theme? Like, what's the fandom's thoughts there? What happened at Summerhall? Was it something magical? Because they were trying to, have Valeria's magic come back and get the dragons to hatch? Was this something like what happened to the one daughter? Guys, I just don't remember the names. The one daughter, when she comes back on the dragon from Valeria and she has like all that stuff in her, like, is it something like that dangerous happening because they're dealing with that magic? Was it sabotage so the dragons don't come back? Did a dragon get born, but it was like evil and it went differently than when it went with Dany? I am curious and I'd love to know what people think. I don't think there's much more information from this, so I wonder if the fandom even has much to say, but I did get a little emo about that letter because I'm always gonna love Dunk, And then finally we come on to Aerys Targaryen, kind of stuff that is happening within the main series itself. And one of the things I found most fascinating about this is I realized, yes, a lot of the information in this book we already know, technically, from the main series. Speaking particularly of Aerys and Tywin. However, you discover this information so piecemeal from different people, from different sources across all the novels, that I don't think I always was putting it fully together. The wonderful thing about this novel is you just see the events one after the other. Aerys and Tywin and all these people we know, and exactly the order that the events happened. And because of that, it did give me a greater understanding. I do feel like I learned new things in this book, but it's very possible you guys would be like, no, that was in the main series, but I just didn't pick up on it. I didn't realize that Tywin and Aerys were such close friends. That was really interesting for me. And it made me think a lot of the power struggles of Tywin as we see in the main series, like when we noticed that he was actually kind of the one ruling the kingdom and doing things that were beneficial for the kingdom, and Aerys was getting credit, and how the relationship devolved and why Tywin might have been reluctant to relinquish some power and just his personality in general, and to really see how crazy Aerys was in the end. Because again, seeing it is different than hearing about it. He was called the Mad King. You know something's wrong, but seeing all of the things he actually did, and you're like, you are completely mad and you are not good for the kingdom. But at the same time, seeing why that Aerys was overthrown and that it wasn't necessarily always in like the best interest of the kingdom. I have complicated feelings about Robert in general. But you also get this sense, again, with Tywin and Aerys, of a sort of repeating history, not in the same way, but you have Robert and Ned, and they were childhood friends, and with Jon Arryn, and how their relationship evolved and changed when power was brought into play, and how those things keep repeating themselves. I don't feel like I'm explaining myself well, but I saw a lot of connections there that just came a little bit to the forefront when I saw Tywin with Aerys. I also want to say, like, as a side note, I loved reading about Sir Barristan. Again, this is probably stuff I knew in the novel, but I didn't really think a lot about Barristan until A Dance with Dragons. So hearing how brave he was and the feats he did and how cool he was, I'm like, yeah, you are cool. And I really liked him in the novel, and I liked reading about him here. So as we move on to the end of this first section with Robert's Rebellion, my favorite thing happens that I've read so far in the entire book, and probably a favorite world building element, period, in any of the books. I'm so in love with it. So let me explain my experience as I'm reading this. So I'm reading this, I'm reading about Robert's Rebellion, and all of a sudden there's a few things that are niggling at me as I read. Let me find some passages. So it starts right before actually the section of Robert's Rebellion. It says, not 10 leagues from Harrenhal, Rhaegar fell upon Lyanna Stark of Winterfell and carried her off, lighting a fire that would consume his house and kin and all those he loved, and half the realm besides. But that tale is too well known to warrant repeating here. And that was the first thing that I thought was a little weird, because I made my opinions known in other novels that I think that Rhaegar didn't, steal Lyanna, and that they went willingly together. So at first I was like, oh, that's kind of interesting that in this book they just state it that way, because generally the history previously has been very like, here's what this person says, and here's what this person says, and here are a lot of possibilities, and this was just presented straightforward. So I thought, oh, well, maybe that's just because that really is at this, time in history, that's what people think happened. But then I kept reading, and other things kind of kept popping out like that. For example, it said, but Robert proved his chivalry when he refused to allow the gravely wounded Sir Barristan to be killed, blah, blah, blah. In such fashion did the future king win the fierce devotion of his friends and allies, for few men were ever so open-handed and merciful as Robert Baratheon. I was like, it's not necessarily like how I would describe Robert. And then, just a few paragraphs later, it says, and last of all to die was King Aerys himself at the hand of his remaining Kingsguard knight, Sir Jaime Lannister. Like his father, Sir Jaime did as he thought best for the realm, bringing an end to the Mad King. And I was like, also weird, because that is not how people view Jaime in the main series. No one's like, Jaime did what he thought was best for the realm and rid us of Mad King Aerys. It's like Kingslayer. No one trusts you, Kingslayer. You're like the worst. So finally, I'm like pretty positive in how I feel, but the final nail in the coffin is when it said, as his first act, the unwed king took to wife the most beautiful woman in the realm, Cersei of House Lannister. And I was like, okay, we're sucking up. We have gone into propaganda. Like, very subtly, there is a shift in this novel from history, like a history tone that you see in Fire and Blood, where it is a discovery kind of writing. It is, here's X, Y, and Z. Here are all these possibilities. We'll never know what really happened. To, well, here's what happened. And it's very editorialized and making people look very good. People, perhaps, who are currently in power. And as we saw from the first part where I showed all the crossed out names, I know that Tommen's on the throne. I know what has happened. Cersei was still there when this was being written, and so everything is going to be written in a way that behooves who is currently sitting on the throne. You're not going to besmirch Robert Baratheon's name when his son sits the throne. You're going to say Cersei is the most beautiful because that's what she wants to hear. You're not going to say something bad about Jaime when you know Cersei and Jaime as siblings are very close, like, just from an outsider's perspective. And I loved that detail so much because it doesn't tell you it's shifting. It's just, it sends, there's other writers here, so I don't know if it was a co-writer or George R. R. Martin wrote that part himself, but the subtle shift from historical to propaganda, I loved it. I literally loved it so much. It's such a small detail, but it really just totally enriches the entire part. And it makes me really curious if we do see Fire and Blood 2, if something similar will be there. I wonder how close it will be to what's presented here. Is it going to, the first one is written as if it is a history. So when, I guess, in the timeline of A Song of Ice and Fire, is Fire and Blood 2 written? That's something maybe you guys already know. You can tell me, but I would love it if it did it just like this. The only other thing I want to say as a whole is I haven't changed my mind. I still think Fire and Blood 1 would have been amazing if it ended with the last dragon dying. I still felt that was like a pretty natural endpoint when I was reading A World of Ice and Fire. Not a big deal, but I'm just going to maintain that I think that would have been good. There's also one thing I did want to talk about in the next section already, and I just think it's hilarious that George R. R. Martin talks about unicorns in this book. I don't know why that's so funny to me when he talks about the unicorns of Skagos and how they're not real or whatever. Just in a fantasy book that already has dragons, to be like, why not a rumor of a unicorn? It tickled me. Obviously, I need to also talk about the art. The art is gorgeous in this book. I'm going to just say it. So beautiful. And I'm kind of picky about people art. I don't always love it. And I do think, for the most part, the art of the people in this novel, I shouldn't be looking down, sorry. The art of the people in this novel is so beautiful. I should probably just put him on the screen. Maybe I'll take pictures. But some of these pieces are just so alive. Of the locations. I'm going to flash my favorites on screen. Of some of the locations, of the people really just brings it to life. Totally worth it if you don't own it. I loved looking at these images. Like, I just stayed and stared at them for a really long time. I'm not necessarily someone who has a vivid picture in my head when I read often. And in particular, for whatever reason, I have a really hard time imagining very large spaces. So whenever we talk about keeps, castles, more like locations that are supposed to be sprawling and big and many-roomed, my mind just doesn't really work that way. I just don't really visualize it. So one of my favorite images actually getting to see here in the book was the wall. I just couldn't really conceptualize how big it was. And for some reason, the image of that in this book really gave me a sense that I was missing of what it feels like at the wall. So that was probably one of my favorite images, even though it's kind of simple. I really liked it. I only had a couple bad things to say about the art. Not really bad. One, I'll flash it up on the screen just so it's hard to see. There is this picture of all of the mistresses of Aegon the Unworthy, and I just can't believe they didn't put the people in order of how they described them in the book. That just bothered me so much because I'm reading these and I'm like, this is the weird time the art is kind of off from the descriptions. And then finally, I looked at the left to right and the explanation, and I was like, oh, they just painted them randomly. That's insane. Why would you do that? Could you just paint them in the order they're here so I can read and then look at the image? Okay, that's a small complaint. And then second, this image of Tywin, I can't explain it, just so opposite to how I pictured him in my head. That was pretty rare. I feel like when I saw pictures in this book, I was like, yeah, sure, why not? Like, that's not necessarily how I pictured that person, but as good as any, the way to picture them. And then I saw that picture and I was like, nope. I don't know why. Just doesn't look like Tywin. Can't explain it. I highly enjoyed doing The World of Ice and Fire. It was definitely a different read. It wasn't as narrative forward as Fire and Blood, so it definitely took me a little bit longer to get through not because it's unenjoyable, but it is like a coffee table book where you're kind of reading a few pages at a time. So I'm excited to keep going and reading more about all the other locations. I'd love to know if you guys think I'm gonna have a lot to say about it. I feel like I won't, but if you wanna see a second video, maybe shortly about that stuff, let me know in the comments below. Tell me your favorite parts of A World of Ice and Fire that I obviously didn't talk about because there was a lot. I did mostly skip over the stuff that was in Fire and Blood, so there's just kind of the new info is what I was focused on. But I do love the images. I think that makes it worth it for sure. I would look through these all the time, especially of the locations actually, because like I said, I can't really imagine them. Also, let me know if you like this kind of casual go through of this book. It's very different than what I normally do. Not sure how I feel about it, so you can let me know. And as always, if you like this kind of content, please like and subscribe. That is the best way to support me. As far as the Song of Ice and Fire content, like I've read the books now. I've read it all. It'll be probably rereads and some theme videos coming up. I do have some in my pocket. And if you want to see what I'm currently reading as well as other nerdy rants, you can check me out on Instagram at bookborn.reviews. I'll see you next time. Bye.